Hello and welcome to Drydock episode 55. Let's try and get a few minor bits of channel admin out the way ASAP. So just a quick note to say that the entries for the Battle Cruiser Design Competition are now closed, and we will be processing, thanks to a couple of helpers on Discord, we will be processing those entries and announcing the winners hopefully by the end of the month. So the videos we're taking selected questions from for the first 20 minutes are the videos on the Dido class and the Interwar Destroyer development video. For obvious reasons, as with some other videos previously, the Interwar Destroyer development video involves so many sources, I'm not going to list them all here. If you want to know what they are, specifically for any particular part, please comment and I'll tell you in the comments below. For the Dido class, the three main sources used were Norman Friedman's book on British cruisers, the International Encyclopedia of Cruisers, and D.K. Brown's Nelson to Vanguard, all of which are very good publications. Anyway, on with questions. Josh Thomas Moore asks, would it be fair to say that the Norway campaign was a mistake for the German Navy given their losses, especially in destroyers? I don't think the campaign itself can be described as a mistake, given the strategic objectives the Germans were trying to achieve. Namely things like securing access to Swedish iron or denying the Allies the potential base that Norway could be, and obviously occupied Norway greatly complicated later routes to and from the USSR, albeit that was somewhat on the horizon and not an immediate concern at the time of the invasion. But overall, the strategic thinking behind the Norway campaign from the German perspective was relatively sound. As far as the execution of the campaign, that you could say was riddled with flaws and mistakes quite considerably. Germany went into that with the two Scharnhorst just about being in service, and a relatively reasonable force of light and heavy cruisers, at least for what the Kriegsmarine could physically be expected to put together in time for the Norway campaign, given that obviously it was starting almost from scratch. It came out of it with two badly damaged battleships, the Blucher on the ocean floor more than a few months after it had come into service. Most of its light cruiser force was either sunk or badly damaged, and yeah, the Battle of Narvik put paid to the vast majority of its modern destroyers as well. So yeah, from that perspective, outside of really of sinking glorious, the Kriegsmarine's campaign in Norway was pretty disastrous. It certainly could have been planned better. It certainly could have been executed a lot better. But at the same time, that is with a significant benefit of hindsight. And let's face it, the Kriegsmarine did not have the world's greatest depth of knowledge when it came to naval amphibious operations off an enemy coast. And let's be fair, most people at that time didn't either. So there are some obvious things they could have done a lot better. And so yeah, I'd say the campaign by the Kriegsmarine itself was poorly executed and contained many mistakes. The campaign in total of the invasion of Norway, not so much. Savong asks, in Nelson to Vanguard, D.K. Brown describes the Dido class as well suited for the Royal Navy requirements if only it had a better armament, and suggests either 10 US 5-inch or 10 British 4.5-inch. Do you think this change would have made a better ship overall? Also, should the British have focused their medium caliber gunwork on the 4.5-inch instead of the 5.25 and 4.7-inch as the main gun for the Dido and its destroyers, and the secondary battery for larger ships? So, yeah, it's a game of two halves on this. The theory behind the 5.25-inch gun was perfectly sound. That is to have as heavy a shell as you possibly could, in order to maximize effect against surface targets, and a long-barreled anti-aircraft gun to ensure maximum range against air targets. In theory, great, fantastic. In practice, not so much, partly due to the weight of the shell, partly due to issues with the turrets themselves, and partly due to the fact that it was all well and good having effectively a long-range anti-aircraft sniper gun. if you couldn't actually direct the gun accurately at long range, this was largely pointless. As I mentioned in the Vanguard video, once all those issues were resolved, the 5.25 became a fairly lethal weapon, and various ships equipped with it, again, as I mentioned in that video and elsewhere, became highly effective vessels that could reach out beyond the 5-inch 38 caliber sphere of death that the US fleet could exert in the latter stages of the Pacific War. But, and this is a very big but, that's 1945. The 5.25 inch was brought into service in the late 1930s. So, although the 5.25 inch theory was fine and eventual execution was fine, for the purposes of the war, the bulk of it at least, I would say DK Brown is absolutely correct in that the Didos, if they'd either been armed with basically kind of like an Atlanta with 5-inch 38 caliber twins, or 4.5-inch Royal Navy guns, as you can see here, so lovingly modelled by HMS Renown, then yes, for the bulk of the war, they probably would have been far, far more effective. And that would have made the ship, well, if it's a far more effective anti-aircraft ship, it would have made it a far better ship overall. Personally, I would have probably gone with a 4.5-inch, because it's a slightly longer barreled weapon, which makes it a bit more effective as an anti-surface weapon, and the Royal Navy needed the anti-surface component just as much as the anti-aircraft component. And also the 4.5-inch overall is, in and of itself, a slightly lighter gun. Therefore, you can either fit more of them on, or if the weight margin isn't quite enough to allow for that, you can put on other top weight like additional 20 and 40 millimeter or more radars, etc., before you have to start sacrificing something. Now, as for the latter part of your question, should they focus their medium caliber gun work on something that wasn't the 5.25 or the 4.7? The later models of 4.7 were fine. The thinking behind the AA dual-purpose mounting on of the 4.7 on things like the tribals was flawed, but that's more a flaw in doctrine than it is with a flaw in the gun. Obviously, later models proved you could make a high elevation 4.7. But with that said, in terms of commonality and getting the best use out of it, then yes, with hindsight, probably taking this 4.5-inch gun and developing it as a blanket rapid-fire destroyer and Dido class and battleship secondary battery weapon probably would have resulted in better outcomes for the Royal Navy during the Second World War. Again, apart from anything else, the 4.5-inch twin turret is significantly lighter than the 5.25-inch twin turret, which, apart from the fact that it's probably a far more effective anti-aircraft gun during the early and middle part of the war, it would be available in greater numbers because it was easier to produce, so you could have had more ships armed with more modern armament, but also because of that lighter weight, you could fit more of them on the larger ships. So perhaps instead of having 8 guns per side in 4 turrets on the King George V's, you might have been able to get 5 guns 5 turrets per side for a total of 10 guns, as was done on Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, for example. And those are smaller ships than King George V. So if they'd taken the stepped approach that they took with 5.25s, they might even have managed to get 6 on them. And you can imagine the number of 4.5-inch turrets they might have been able to get on something like Hood if Hood had ever been refitted. So yeah, with hindsight, I definitely agree. If I was catapulted back in time to 1935, I would almost certainly tell the Royal Navy just crank out as many of these 4.5-inch guns in various turret mounts and etc. as you possibly can, rather than 5.25 and 4.7. But at the same time, you can point out flaws in their thinking when it comes to using the 5.25 and the 4.7. But if you look at purely the information they had available to them in the late 1930s, it's much harder to sort of say they should have taken this other route. ST Rub asks, APDs of the US fleet, were they a good idea or just a dead end in the destroyer-destroyer escort tech tree? So for those of you unaware, the APD, also known as the high-speed transport, was a concept that the US came up with, which was to take older destroyers and later destroyer escorts, enlarge the superstructure, and in some cases sacrifice a portion of the armament in order to carry troops, usually between 1 and 200. And then these ships, which were obviously then considerably faster than your average amphibious assault ship and more heavily armed, would run in and drop off men, supplies, and also be able to offer a limited degree of fire support to the men that they were landing, as well as in theory being able to stand up to smaller warships that might try to interdict them. They were fairly useful for things like what we today would call special forces raids, sort of commando operations, or yes, fair enough, commandos are a Royal Marine thing, but you know what I mean. And in campaigns like the Guadalcanal campaign, they're also quite useful because nobody had absolute superiority for a significant portion of that. So the ability to dash in and deliver supplies and men under the cover of darkness and then get out again fairly quickly whilst being able to defend yourself against things that you might run across was fairly useful. So I would say they're a qualified good idea. They're a good idea for the situation that the US Navy found itself operating in around 1942, early 1943. But in an ideal world, you don't want to try and have a jack of all trades, master of none ship. If you need to move troops in quickly, ideally you want a dedicated high-speed troop transport. And when it comes to firepower, well, the simple fact of the matter is if you're transporting large numbers of men, you don't want to be in a gunfight. That's what full-on warships are for. And this is why later on during the island hopping campaign, you see the US Navy adopting tactics where you bring your troops in on your troop transports and your amphibious assault ships, and the warships clear the way so that the area is safe to land in the first place. So yes, under ideal circumstances, an APD would not be a good idea because it doesn't do anything especially well, and puts a fairly large number of troops at risk. But in a situation where you're fighting over an area of territory where superiority in the sea and in the air is contested, they are actually a reasonably good idea. But because of that niche specialization of a literal peer opponent fight and or special forces operations, they didn't see that much use going forward once the US Navy had established superiority. Y-Wing asks, Atlanta versus Dido, or Dido, who would win? I think this is another one of those situations where it depends entirely on what time of the war that you're talking about. It's very much a sliding scale, in my opinion. So, at the beginning of the war, when the 5.25-inch guns still have fairly significant issues in terms of training, rate of fire, reliability, etc., and fire control systems are not tremendously advanced on light cruisers, the Atlanta is going to have a significant advantage. It's got more guns, it's got a significantly higher rate of fire, and at any kind of practical engagement range, the fact that 5-inch 38 is a slightly shorter range, lower velocity weapon isn't going to make that much difference. It's just going to plaster the Dido or Dido straight off the face of the map. So yeah, that's probably 1938 to maybe 1942-ish going into 43. As the war progresses and the issues with the 5.25-inch turrets are resolved, and obviously this is assuming it's one of the British ships that actually has its full complement of 5.25s, then more effective fire control and radar systems start to come into play on both sides, to be fair, but the British ship benefits considerably more from the extended range, not only because its own guns are actually working for a change, but also because as a longer barreled weapon with a slightly heavier shell, there's more range on the 5.25 to exploit. So as you trend towards the end of the war, also, I mean, given the fact that the British ship does have torpedoes, which are a bit of a wild card factor, which the Atlantas don't. But yes, as you trend towards the end of the war, I would give it more and more to the Dido or Dido class, purely on that basis of they're able to exploit their greater range and heavier firepower better. Their rate of fire's gone up, their reliability's gone up, And at the same time, because of the Atlanta's focus, well, actually, to be fair, both of their focuses on anti-air warfare, but particularly because the Atlantas were almost overloaded out of the dockyard, the Atlantas themselves are beginning to sacrifice armament such as the wing 5.25-inch turret, 5-inch 38 turrets, in order to allow them to bring more 40 and 20mm to bear. But that does reduce their overall main gun firepower, which is probably going to be the most important thing in the hypothetical cruiser versus cruiser fight. Plus, of course, although that stops them rolling over, it doesn't negate entirely their top weight issues, which means that they're going to be more vulnerable to battle damage and more likely to roll over with fewer hits. So, yeah, slightly longer way of saying early to mid-war Atlanta, later mid-war to the end of the war advantage Dido, or Dido. Josh Thomas Moore asks, how useful would HMS Dreadnought have been had it fought at Jutland? Well, it's another Dreadnought battleship, but the Royal Navy wasn't exactly short of those at Jutland. A few extra guns would have helped, I guess, but it wouldn't have changed things all that much, to be honest. The actual battleship engagement part of Jutland was relatively short, and, well, the Germans, as soon as they saw what they were facing, both times just went, no, I don't think so, and left the field. So, yeah, I mean, Dreadnought had some of its half sister ships in the St. Vincent class were present, and, well, they shot at some Germans, and maybe they hit some things, and that's really about it. I mean, as I say, a single Dreadnought battleship isn't really going to tip the scales any more or less in the Royal Navy's favour, considering the numbers of Dreadnought battleships they had there already. I think probably the only single ship that might have changed things even slightly at Jutland would probably have been if HMS Queen Elizabeth was available. And so 5th Battle Squadron therefore consisted of the entirety of the Queen Elizabeth class. That might have made a difference, but I'll speculate on that when someone asks me to. Trench Gun asks, how useful were flying boats like the PBY Catalina and the various Japanese flying boats in the Pacific, and did they ever work directly with a fleet? Direct fleet work by flying boats was pretty rare, largely on the basis, to be honest, that when you're talking about the Pacific, almost every operation that took place would either have carrier support, in which case you use the carrier planes, or larger capital ships, sort of heavy cruisers and battleships, some light cruisers as well, which would have their own float planes. So in extreme circumstances, you could use those if for some reason you didn't have a carrier with you. And because they were actually with the ships, their shorter operational range was made up for by the fact that they were actually in the operational area in the first place, whereas a flying boat operating out of an island or something similar to that, or I suppose an atoll, would have to transit to the location and then find the ships it was supposed to be supporting and then conduct its sweep, which actually might end up with its operational range in useful terms actually being less than a carrier or catapult launched aircraft, and the time lag between the aircraft taking off and actually being useful to anybody in particular is considerably less. It was considerably more than if you were launching from a ship that was already in your own fleet. There were some instances where major fleet movements were planned which were supplied partially with a recon screen of flying boats, but didn't happen that often. Slightly more common in the Atlantic, where operational ranges were slightly shorter and ships tended to be sailing from pretty much the same bases all the time. But in general terms of how useful they were actually incredibly useful. I mean, weird Japanese attempts to bomb Pearl Harbor a second time aside, the flying boats had a huge number of uses. There was general recon, which was always pretty useful. Anti-submarine work, they were very good at that because, well, they had a fairly large carrying capacity compared to shipborne craft, so they could carry multiple depth charges and other similar anti-submarine weapons. Obviously, being able to fly high for considerable amounts of time, they had a fairly good wide view across the ocean, and with that vertical distance also meant that they could spot submarines that were in shallow diving conditions relatively easily. And and their operational range meant they could cover huge distances. So as a way of not entirely sanitizing, but severely discouraging submarine activity, they were fairly useful, albeit obviously in the expanse of the Pacific, you're never going to be able to do that completely. But you could identify tactical areas where you could do that. Additionally, in terms of supplies, you could use them to drop supplies or not necessarily kick them out the door, but maybe sidle up and let supplies off on small island garrisons. Because again, they're a lot faster than ships, and being flying boats, they can land on water, which is quite handy. But one of their most important roles was search and rescue, because obviously a flying boat, again, it can carry a lot of life-preserving supplies, which is fairly useful when you're searching for survivors of a warship, which tend to be in the dozens to hundreds, hopefully. But also, they can land on the water, they can offer assistance directly, and for things like downed aircrew from aircraft or potentially survivors from submarines, which tended to be significantly smaller numbers of men, unfortunately, they could actually land and pick up survivors directly if there were only a few of them. And between that and, say, their long loiter time, being able to survey large areas, if a ship went missing or aircraft were known to have ditched, flying boats were invaluable in getting some of them back alive. So they're very useful in that circumstance as well. So yeah, flying boats generally very useful in the Pacific as all sorts of things, but not so much direct fleet support. Tom Riley asks, how do navies manage to design ships that have stability problems to the extent of turning over? Trust me, that is a question that has been asked at an awful lot of investigations, both naval and civilian. In short form, the answer is that it depends on the Navy and its organisational layout when it comes to ship design. Now, obviously, we can see in the picture here the Vasa, which is possibly the classic example of such a ship. However, I would emphasise that whilst ship design was a science, it was not vastly scientific in the way that we would understand it today. It was very much a case of trial, error, and experimentation during the wooden warship era. Full on sort of calculated mathematical scientific design that wasn't sort of derivatives off of previous designs didn't really come in until the 19th century. And even then, it took quite a while for it to become completely widespread throughout navies. So if we're looking in the what you might call the era when people should have known better, the really top-heavy unstable designs that tended to roll over and sink either came from designs that were made by completely unqualified people that for various reasons were foisted on navies, usually by political concerns, which is where you get things like HMS Captain from. And the other one tends to be where a particular navy's design board or method of ship design and construction is spread out across multiple departments that won't talk to each other particularly well. To use a modern term, very siloed thinking. And the US Navy, unfortunately, especially when it came to its destroyers, but also to a certain degree when it came to cruisers, was particularly bad at this in the interwar period because you had multiple bureaus, and yeah, as I said, they basically didn't talk to each other all that much, and they were assigned different portions of the ship design on the assumption that when it all came together, it would somehow magically work, and usually didn't. This is, I mean, the thing, as I covered in the, ironically enough, in the interwar development video where this question is taken from, the Sims class and that particular debacle was a kind of a wake-up call for the US Navy, and they did then start the process of amalgamating some of the bureaus so that they would be forced to talk to each other to avoid this happening again. So yeah, generally, that's where most of the unstable ship designs come from, because in most circumstances, when you have a navy where the ship design is sort of from keel up done by a single department, or very closely connected departments, they tend to notice this in advance and take measures to remedy the issue before it actually occurs in a ship that's been physically built. That's not to say that that kind of measure avoided things entirely. The Royal Navy certainly still was guilty of a few top-heavy designs during this period. However, in those circumstances, not just in the Royal Navy but in other navies as well, where ship design was handled in a more coherent and centralized manner, it tended to be from feature creep. So there might be a fairly solid, stable design that would come up, and then various people, be they admirals, be they civilian oversight, or whatever, would start asking for additional features to be added to a ship in a way that the ship was never really designed for. And obviously you'd end up with top-heavy designs, especially considering that most of the additional features in the kind of period that we're mostly looking at the moment tended to be things like fire control, radar, and anti-aircraft systems, which in and of themselves don't weigh a particularly large amount, but they tend to all need to be mounted fairly high up in the ship, which exacerbates the effect of their weight on a ship's stability. John Fisher asks, is there any reason the German and Japanese navies mounted most of their main guns firing to the rear whilst others had them forward in the attack position? I think it's a little bit unfair to characterise the Japanese navy in that manner. I mean, pretty much the only ships I can think of offhand that would fit that particular description would probably be the Fusos and Iseis, and they were more turret farms in the traditional early 1910s style than anything else. If you look at their later heavy cruisers like the Miyokos, Megamis, etc., and the Toneis especially, they had pretty much all their, well, not well in the Toneis case all, but in the rest of the heavy cruisers case, the majority of their firepower up front, and well, the Nagata was an even split. Yamato was more, well, 2 turrets forward, 1 aft. So I think that the characterizing the Japanese Navy in that manner is probably not accurate. In terms of the German Navy, and as you compare them to other navies having their guns mostly forward, it's basically a case of naval doctrine and what they expect the ships to do. So we've kindly been graced by Königsberg here, which is possibly one of the most obvious examples of this thinking. And it basically comes down to the fact that at the time that a number of German warships, including pretty much all their light cruisers and quite a few of their destroyers, were designed, they were very, very much the smaller navy compared to pretty much anybody they were expecting to fight. So they were expecting to mostly do commerce raiding and other forms of raiding and annoyance missions, with the expectation that the enemy would be able to mount a superior defense or even come after them with a superior offense in terms of numerical advantage, at which point they would have to retreat. And if they are going to have to retreat, and they're expecting that most of their engagements to be retreating engagements, it makes a certain amount of sense to have the majority of your firepower able to face aft, because then you can hopefully deal a fair bit of damage to the enemy whilst they're chasing you down. You see the German design shift as their naval thinking shifts. So as the fleet grows larger, and bear in mind they did not plan to fight the Royal Navy, Z plan aside, and even then that was more of a sort of high seas fleet style holding action type fleet. The primary enemy envisaged for most of the period when German ships were actually under construction, as opposed to the Z plan, which post-dated pretty much everything that the Germans actually managed to build, was France. And by the time their navy, the German navy, the Kriegsmarine, was getting to a point where it could rival and gradually begin to eclipse the French navy, their thinking changed, because now they could face them, in theory, in straight-up open combat, and this is why the later ships, like the Hipper-class cruisers, the Scharnhorst and the Bismarcks, all go for either an even layout, which is pretty typical, 2 turrets forward, 2 turrets aft, or like with the Scharnhorst, when you've got triples, 2 forward and 1 aft. They don't repeat the kind of 2 triples at the back, 1 forward that the earlier German light cruisers have. So yeah, it's effectively reflective of naval doctrine and whether or not you expect to be able to have a stand-up fight with your opponent, or whether you expect to have to constantly be retreating from your opponent. Um, weight saving issues aside, things like the Nelsons obviously had a little bit of a more offensive mindset. The Lost Beaver asks, in the video covering the Courageous class battle cruisers, you mentioned that they were classified as large light cruisers. How the hell did Fisher manage to hide the fact that they were actually battle cruisers? Also, what made Flag Officer Seymour so rubbish at his job? So I'll cover Seymour first quickly, but it has been reiterated or said in other dry docks. Basically, he wasn't actually a fully trained signals officer, and yet due to personal and political connections with Beatty, he ended up being signals and communications officer for the second most important formation in the British fleet in World War One. Go figure, yay, nepotism, I think is the correct term, possibly. Anyway, as regards the Courageous class, the reason they were classified as large light cruisers was effectively as a way of dodging around the Chancellor at the time, because the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which in the States would be, I guess, Secretary of the Treasury, something like that, had put in an edict that said, no, but we are not paying for anything bigger than a light cruiser this year, because reasons. Some of them valid, some of them not so much. And this was basically designed to try and stop people like Fisher building large capital ships. So Fisher just said, yes, sir, okay, I understand. I fully appreciate your position. I will not build anything larger than a light cruiser. I may build a large light cruiser, but it will still be a light cruiser. And if anyone questioned him during the initial design period, he go, well, look, very light armor, very high speed, very shallow draft, sort of light cruiser characteristics, isn't it? And everyone go, yeah, okay, no one would be insane enough to build a large capital ship with that kind of draft and that kind of minimal armor protection, so I guess he must be telling the truth. At least when you're trying to fool accountants, that kind of flies. And then when he actually laid the ships down, they were subject to a great deal of secrecy and a great deal of, well, what they don't know won't hurt them, will it? The whole situation probably cost the Royal Navy a fair number of useful ships because, at least as far as I can tell, if it wasn't for that particular restriction, what the Royal Navy would have actually got out of it would have been improved versions of the Renown class. And given that Renown and Repulse gave fairly useful service to the Royal Navy in World War II, if those three Courageous, Glorious, and Furious had been built in that manner, yeah, they might well have seen a fair bit of active service in the Second World War, albeit it does raise a question of what might have happened with the Royal Navy's carrier force, but that's a complete aside for another day. So, yes, basically, the way he managed to hide they were battle cruisers was by flat out lying to people, as well as lies of omission, and then once he actually got the ships designed and the construction was underway, he just didn't tell anyone what was going on until it was far too late and the ships were pretty much near complete. And, well, accountants don't like leaving their offices that often, so, yeah. Biffy Commander asks, why did the Japanese keep adding more terrible 25mm AA guns to their ships? Did no one realise they were ineffective? Was it a Bureau of Ordnance deal where the frontline personnel knew they were bad, but those at the top didn't want to hear it? Or did they know they were bad, they just didn't think they could build anything better? Mostly the latter. It's not that they didn't think they could build something better, it was more a fact of they couldn't practically in the constraints that they had. Bear in mind that one of the major reasons that pushed Japan into making a decision to go to war in the first place was resource shortages, albeit that's mostly oil. But once the war got going in full, they had resource issues pretty much from the start. Their industry was in no way equipped to keep up with the rate of losses they actually ended up encountering, and basically they didn't have a decent light to medium anti-aircraft gun that they had a production line open and ready to go for. They had some relatively decent anti-aircraft guns in the works, or that they could build, but they were sort of upper end, medium, and into heavy caliber AA, things like 3-inch and 5-inch guns. And those are a lot more resource intensive. In the case of the 5-inch guns, they're in demand for destroyer installation on destroyers. And in the case of the 3-inch guns, they tend to end up on the biggest capital ships first. And because they're a lot more resource intensive, you can't make as many of them. They're a lot heavier, so you can't add as many of them to existing ships. And also, even if they've got the spare displacement, you may not have the space, which is another major problem. And so it was a case of, well, we need something. And in theory, if you throw enough shells into the air, you might hit something. And let's face it, yes, the 25mm was definitely not in any way, shape, or form the world's best anti-aircraft gun. It wasn't even mediocre. To a certain degree, it had been outpaced at the time. Even the 20mm Oerlikon kind of fell out of favour towards the latter part of the war. But it was basically simply a case of, well, if we try and develop, copy, or steal another design, it's going to take time to get that up and running in production, at which point, by the time we actually have the thing working and available in large numbers, well, the ships that then sunk due to lack of any particularly upgraded anti-aircraft firepower aren't coming back. So it was, relatively speaking, quick, easy, and cheap to just spam out more 25mm AA, stick it on absolutely everything, and as I say, well, it's still a 25mm anti-aircraft shell. If it hits an aircraft, it's going to hurt. So yeah, have several dozen of them on even a light cruiser, and hopefully when somebody comes in close, you'll hit something. And let's face it, the US Navy was not short of casualties in its pilot arm, so the Japanese AA did do something. It just wasn't something that was enough. Angelo Barker asks, what do you think would have happened if Italy's Littorio went against Bismarck? Well, this is a little bit of a contentious question, isn't it? But I think it's one where I'm fairly happy to give a reasonably definitive answer, at least as far as all the information that I can come across indicates. And that is basically that I think this fight is going to come down to which particular batch of shells have you decided to issue to the Italians this week? Now, the reason I say that is because the gun itself, the Italian 15-inch gun, is a very powerful, very high velocity, and very accurate gun, at least in trials. Whether or not this accuracy actually occurs on the battlefield seems to vary wildly, engagement by engagement, and the only thing that really explains that and is backed up by the evidence of not necessarily the Italian shells themselves, because we don't have any to examine, but by the evidence we have from documents that point out what the tolerances on Italian shell production were, which were considerably wider margins than practically anybody else would ever accept, would seem to indicate that basically the accuracy was affected depending on which batch of shells you had, because quality control was pretty terrible. And one of the easiest ways of pointing this out is that Littorio engaged targets at 32,000 yards. At 32,000 yards, even an Iowa, by all trial accounts, would struggle to hit anything. But at that range, Littorio was actually getting good groupings, as in groupings that would inevitably have led to a hit had the bombardment continued for any considerable period of time. Conversely, Vittorio Veneto, when engaging almost 10,000 yards closer, had a truly awful, and I do mean awful, shot dispersion. Not only were shots landing pretty much anywhere on the broad scope of the horizon, but the spread of their shells was absolutely terrible. I mean, it was engaging town-class cruisers. A town-class cruiser is not a small target. And to give you some context to this, at the Battle of Jutland, and bear in mind, that's the Battle of Jutland, this is World War One we're talking about, the 15-inch 42 caliber guns on the Queen Elizabeths engaged at a range that was not that much less than what the Vittorio Veneto was engaging at, and their shot groupings were actually too tight. Believe it or not, they were so tight that they missed German battle cruisers, but at ranges such that if their shot grouping had been a little bit more dispersed and more typical of the era, they probably actually would have scored 1 or 2 hits with any given salvo. And that shot dispersion was about 250 yards for the entire group of shells. Now, a town-class cruiser is 180 to almost 190 meters long, depending on the subclass. So, purely in terms of horizontal dispersion, not obviously accounting for the fact that it is a circle, but a Queen Elizabeth class engaging a town class sized target would probably expect for, say, 6 of those shells to be at least within the horizontal dispersion. And then when you take account of the vertical dispersion, you'd maybe, with that kind of salvo, assuming that you've got the range, you'd expect maybe 2 or 3 hits from a salvo with that kind of grouping. Yeah, the dispersion of the Italian shells in that particular engagement, despite the fact that this was World War II, there were shells landing. The closest 2 shells to the town class in Gloucester that was being shot at, one of them was almost a ship length ahead, the other was over a ship length behind. So it's a shot dispersion of more than half a kilometre between 2 shells, and the rest of the shells aren't even in the flipping picture. Yeah, that's bad. I mean, when you run the numbers based on tolerances, and that's assuming the shells were manufactured to tolerance in the first place, which you can't necessarily guarantee, but assuming they were even manufactured within acceptable tolerances for the Italian Navy, the possible shot dispersion is up to 750 metres. It's half a mile. You're never going to hit anything with that. So, yeah, the long and the short of that particular little rant is to say that if Littorio has been issued with one of these absolutely terrible batches of shells, the Bismarck is going to win on the basis that Littorio couldn't hit the broadside of a barn door if you put the ship inside the barn. Conversely, if they'd been issued with decent shells, I maybe say like Littorio was what it historically seemed to have been issued with at least one battle, that changes matters entirely. Because, as I say, Littorio's accuracy and fast accuracy was stupendous at that 32,000 yard engagement range. And I say that not only because, well, it was actually straddling targets with good shot dispersion at 32,000 yards, which is near enough a miracle in naval gunnery terms, but it was landing those salvos within the first 2 or 3 rounds of fire, which means that its range finding and fire control equipment were superb. So, yeah, because both sides have very high velocity 15-inch guns, they're at any kind of reasonable engagement range. Neither side has particularly any armor protection against the other unless they're at sort of weird angles. But assuming that they've got decent shells for a change, the Littorio seems to have demonstrated historically an ability that would probably lead to it scoring hits on Bismarck significantly further out than Bismarck could hope to score hits on Littorio. And the armor penetration on from the Littorio's guns, by most metrics, is actually even better than the German, and the Italian shells have less of an issue with not detonating. Now, granted, depending on how much stock you put on the rather weird main belt armor protection system that the Italian battleships had, the Littorios may or may not be better protected than the Bismarcks. But either way, basically either way, Littorio actually has a practical immunity zone at long range where it can, assuming it's got decent shells, fairly reliably guarantee that it's going to start hitting Bismarck and hurting it, and Bismarck is going to be engaging at a point where, by all known metrics of how German guns and fire control, well, anyone's guns and fire control performed apart from Littorio's, they probably aren't going to be scoring a hit. So, yeah, rant and long explanation aside, the answer to your question would be give the Littorios a good set of shells, and I will hand this engagement to the Littorio on a plate. But, historically speaking, it's going to be flip a coin as to whether or not you actually get that. So yeah, have fun with that. And so on to the Patreon questions. Dave Collier asks, 2 parts. Can you tell us a little bit about HMS Newport's actions at the opening of the Suez Canal, and where do you think it comes in the all-time league of peacetime trolling by the Royal Navy? Well, it's a fun little story, isn't it? Let's take a quick look. So yes, 1869, the Suez Canal is being opened. This is, of course, an occasion for much pomp and ceremony, since it is going to massively reduce the transit time to and from Asia, to Europe and back again, because you don't have to go around the entirety of Africa. And for the British, it's very important because it means they get to India a lot more quickly, and also it means you've just handed them a double stranglehold on most European shipping, since it now means that the most economical route to the Far East is past Gibraltar, which they happen to own, and then through the Mediterranean, where the strongest part of the Royal Navy actually is. So they're quite happy with this event. So obviously the great and the good of Europe all show up, and they're all preparing to go through the canal for the first time. France at this point is running one of its various experiments with having a royal family. This particular instance wouldn't end with mass beheadings, but it would still end. But nevertheless, at this point, the French have managed to send some of their royalty along, and being that the French royal who's shown up is the highest ranking there, and also showed up early, her yacht, the Aigle, which obviously means eagle, is waiting to be first in line, as only befits someone of high royal rank. Of course, along comes HMS Newport, seen here in later life under another name. It's only a small gunboat, but the commanding officer can't quite stomach the French being the first to achieve anything maritime on the watch of the Royal Navy. Unfortunately, L'Aigle has been placed up front, and there's not a lot he can do about that in the open. So what does he do? Well, since the canal is due to open the next day, he waits for nightfall, switches off all the lights on the ship, and very carefully sneaks through all the assembled shipping, which obviously has formed a nice, neat, orderly queue after L'Aigle, and when dawn breaks, shockingly, there's now a Royal Navy ship in front of the French ship, and he's managed to put himself so close that it's actually impossible to easily or conveniently move him or go past him, which means, unless you want to have a very, very embarrassing sort of day-long delay, you're just going to have to let the Royal Navy go first. The French, let's just say they were not best pleased, but as I didn't have that much of a choice, so along goes HMS Newport quite happily, and thus a British ship is the first vessel to pass through the Suez Canal. The general public in Britain were quite enamoured of this. It did, however, cause just a little bit of a diplomatic incident, so to coin a phrase from a wonderful sci-fi series, the Admiralty were not entirely sure as to whether to boot him out of the ship or give him a medal, and unfortunately couldn't quite bring themselves to fire a medal straight into his skull by means of reward and punishment at the same time. Therefore, they decided that in order to assuage French feelings, they would give him an official reprimand for his careless and undiplomatic and crass action, whilst unofficially they would give him a vote of thanks, basically for sticking one to the French, which is a favourite British pastime, even though we're supposed to have been allies for the better part of the last century. Where this ranks in terms of the Royal Navy's peacetime trolling, well, the Royal Navy gets up to quite a lot of that, so it's difficult to say. I mean, in terms of putting one over on the French, it's a pretty good one, because it's not just a random prank or anything like that. It's something that you can't really take back. The first ship through the Suez Canal is the first through the Suez Canal. You can't be the second first ship through. So in terms of that, pretty good. But then at the same time, you're talking about a Royal Navy whose peacetime activities included, well, when the captured USS President was found to be unfit for further service, they couldn't possibly let this opportunity get away from them, so rather than just scrap the ship, well, I mean, you can't scrap a wooden ship, rather than take apart a wooden ship about 5 years or so, actually no, 1812, about 5 years after it was captured, they measured it and took some of the most detailed sets of plans and measurements ever taken for a ship of that period, purely so that they could go and build an exact replica. So the rotten ship was taken apart, but they built a near enough perfect replica of the former USS President, and then mysteriously happened to assign the HMS President to a lot of duty on the North American station, where it would parade up and down in front of the USA. Which was, yeah, that's something of a troll by by a fair bit. Then, of course, albeit that is an exercise, so it's not technically fully peacetime trolling, but close enough for government work. You've got, well, not at the time Admiral Woodward, but the officer who would later become Admiral Woodward, and in that role would command the Falklands Task Force. But earlier, he managed to get the drop on an American battle group in the Mediterranean with his lone ship by making himself more visible. And you might be wondering, well, how the heck did he manage that? Yes, his assignment in the exercise was to try and see how close he could get to threatening the US battle group, which was, of course, centered on a carrier. So his solution to this was turn on literally every light on the ship that he possibly could and sail straight towards them at night, because, of course, nobody would be dumb enough to sail a warship at night with all lights blazing straight at its target when its target knows that they're coming. And this actually worked, because the US officers on deck saw this coming and went, can't possibly be a warship. Challenged it, and yeah, he claimed to be the Rawalpindi. Yeah, students of Royal Navy history will recognise exactly where that reference came from. Unfortunately, the US officers at the time apparently were not the world's greatest students of Royal Navy history, and bought the act long enough for him to point out that he now had every missile and gun available pointed straight at the US carrier, and if he opened fire at this point, there would be absolutely nothing they could do about it. So yeah, that was a bit of a masterful piece of trolling, even though there was a gigantic sort of, look at me, I am not actually who I say I am, implicit in the name for anyone who'd cracked open a World War II naval history book. So yes, between those two incidents and various others, it's very difficult to work out just exactly who the greatest Royal Navy peacetime troll was. But I've got to say, actually sneaking ahead of the French in the middle of the night in pitch darkness in a harbour probably has to be in the top 10. Connor Crowley asks, it said the UK wanted Ireland to join the war due to its strategic location for the war in the Atlantic. What benefits would this realistically have provided, given they already controlled Northern Ireland? Presumably this is referring to World War II. On a similar question, on the treaty ports leased to the British in Berehaven, Cobb and Lough Swilly, would these ports have been strategically useful if the British had held on to them? Well, the reason that the UK would have rather welcomed Ireland joining the war against the Axis powers in World War II, as you can hopefully see from the above, is simply the fact that it allows for much, much better protection of convoys. Um, yes, the British control Northern Ireland, but if you have a look, you can see where the little red ship on the bottom left is. The vast majority of convoys that are coming in to the UK are coming via the western approaches. That means basically coming up where that little red ship is, and then either going down the channel or heading for somewhere like Liverpool or Manchester. And Northern Ireland's at the other end of Ireland, which means that escort ships, aircraft, etc., have to then sail out and around the entire island of Ireland in order to go and meet the convoys. This delays them in terms of time to respond to anything. It also means that their operational range is significantly cut because they have to spend fuel to get basically to the southern tip of Ireland and then head out to find the convoy. Now, you might be thinking, well, come on, it's not that far. The UK is not exactly the world's biggest country, and Ireland's visibly smaller than the UK. Yeah, okay, fair enough, compared to a continental mass that happens to be mostly one country. But still, that's adding about 400 to 500 miles to your journey. Now, for most maritime patrol aircraft of the Second World War, that's an awful lot of operational range and capability that you're losing. And even for things like destroyers and escort destroyers, and especially for smaller ships like frigates, corvettes, sloops, etc., that's actually a significant chunk of their operational capability. And bear in mind, that's one way. So you're going up to sort of 800 to 1,000 extra miles every journey if you actually want to come back again. Albeit, fair enough, if you're a ship, you might then escort the convoy into a British port. But yes, so having to operate out of Northern Ireland meant both delays in the time of response, but also it also meant that the ships and the aircraft couldn't stay on station anywhere near as long as they really wanted to. And obviously that cost lives, because if your ships can't be on station for as long, then that opens up the window of opportunity for U-boats to attack for considerably longer. Now, in terms of the treaty ports that are mentioned as being leased, they are pretty much all on the south and southwestern coast of Ireland, which is exactly where they need the British needed to be for ideal operations. Now, would their ports have been strategically useful had the British held on to them? Most definitely. In any kind of war throughout the whole of the 20th century, there would have been some kind of convoy heading for Britain, whether that's just a food convoy or, as we get later on into the Cold War, some kind of supply convoy, like, say, the Reforger convoys, stuff like that. All of that would have been coming through the western approaches, even if it wasn't necessarily coming into Britain. So being able to base ships and aircraft out of those areas on a permanent basis would have dramatically improved the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare and escort capability. Because again, although modern ships obviously can travel significant distances, it's still an extra 400 to 500 miles both ways. So yeah, it would have been a very, very useful. However, it has to be acknowledged, of course, that the Republic of Ireland has never quite been the UK's biggest fan. So, although it would have been very useful, I'm not really going to hold my breath on it happening in any kind of plausible, a plausible alternate timeline, to be perfectly honest. And finally, for this week, Matt Blom asks, in Chester Nimitz's book Reflections on Pearl Harbor, he states the Japanese first mistake at Pearl Harbor was not luring the fleet out to sea. In his words, if those same ships had been lured to sea and sunk, we would have lost 38,000 men instead of 3,800. Do you concur that the Americans would have lost a decisive engagement at sea had they had prior knowledge and responded to the attack force? If so, should this have been a mitigating factor in blame given by the Roberts Commission? So, yes, would the Americans have lost decisive engagement at sea. If they'd sailed out with the ships they had in Pearl Harbour, which rather notably lacked any carriers, which worked out fairly well for them in the end. But in this kind of engagement, if they'd somehow found, maybe by submarine report or something, that a large Japanese fleet was heading for Hawaii, and for whatever reason had decided, stuff it, we're just going to hoist anchor sail with everything we've got in Pearl Harbour and hope that Enterprise and whoever can just catch up whenever. Yeah, they probably would have lost quite badly. I mean, this is late 1941. The US Navy has not learned the lesson of Pearl Harbour yet, for obvious reasons, and the anti-aircraft suites on the battleships and what cruisers and destroyers were available at Pearl Harbour were not the world's greatest, shall we say, by a long shot. And of course, things like the Mark 37 fire control unit and radar, etc., had not become widespread in the US Pacific Fleet at this point. So, yeah, the anti-aircraft potential of the US fleet at sea, in the face of a concerted attack by the entire Japanese aerial strike force, not really all that useful. I mean, fair enough, they would have been on full alert, which would have allowed them to inflict some casualties. But you've got to remember that the casualties that were inflicted, especially during the second wave of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, included attacks by aircraft and that's US aircraft, and obviously defensive fire from shore installations and such like as well. So it's a reduced anti-aircraft battery compared to what could be mustered at the base itself. And yeah, people didn't really appreciate just how powerful air assault could be. Now, fair enough, at the same time, they're not sitting targets, so it would be harder for the Japanese to land strikes on them. But the US standard battle line is not that fast. The Japanese fleet could have conducted a series of hit and fades, just falling back and falling back and falling back. Because the one thing about that fleet is that fleet very definitely outguns the fleet the Japanese sent to the Pearl Harbor attack. So they definitely don't want to get into a firefight with it, but they can afford not to, and they can afford to just keep dropping back and hitting and dropping back and hitting. And every time one of those big attack waves comes in, you are going to be losing ships. The amount of lessons, both in terms of anti-aircraft defense and torpedo defense and all sorts of other valuable lessons that were learned from that particular attack, the list is as long as my arm. But yeah, so I would generally concur with Admiral Nimitz in that, yeah, pretty much the nightmare scenario for the US at the beginning of the war would have been for the Japanese to somehow lure out the fleet that was at Pearl Harbor, let's say sans carriers. And yeah, at that point, yeah, a lot more men are going down, and also it means that you're not going to be able to salvage them, because if they're at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, it's a lot harder to go and find the ships, let alone bring them back up to the surface, compared to when they're sunk at Pearl Harbor itself, which is obviously slightly easier for salvage work. Albeit that obviously most of the burden was historically carried by the US more modern battleships anyway, so potentially the actual offensive strike power outside of the few losses in cruisers and destroyers of the US specifically wouldn't be particularly badly affected. As again, assuming that things like Enterprise aren't actually part of this, but the loss of trained personnel and the morale shock of that scale of defeat at sea would have been quite decisive. So yeah, probably just as well that didn't happen. And so we come to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. You may have noticed a slightly different format to this one, and so this is in response to a few comments as a result of the marathon 3-part Drydock, Patreon Drydock earlier this month. So I am going to, for the rest of the month, try this format, which is slightly different. So the way this differs from previous is that previously there was about 10 minutes devoted to each of the particular videos where selected questions were being taken from. So that made up roughly the first 20 minutes. Then another 20 minutes of questions picked randomly from earlier videos, and then 20 minutes of Discord questions. This format has 15 minutes devoted to each of the selected videos, then another 15 minutes devoted to questions taken from the Drydock associated with that week, and then the last 15 minutes is Patreon questions, and that's in an effort to basically try and draw down a little bit, answer some of the Patreon questions a bit early, but also it means that hopefully when we get to the end of the month, beginning of next, and we have the Patreon dedicated Drydock, hopefully that can then be either kept to roughly an hour or maybe slightly over, but it means people don't have to suddenly be confronted with 2 hours and 45 minutes of me, which is possibly not what you're expecting on a Sunday morning. So yeah. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room with that particular thing is what happens to the Discord questions, because there's not any space allocated to this now. As some users pointed out, a fair number of the Discord questions are actually answered on the Discord in the Discord discussions thread, but others aren't. So what I will probably try and do is I'm going to try and come up with something. At the moment, I'm tentatively thinking of maybe giving people direct responses. So I might go through the Discord question list, because I do want each question to be answered. I'll go through the question list and the discussions thread, work out which questions were missed or haven't been answered or only partially answered, and then I might just record answers or maybe do a live stream or something where I just burn through those sort of ad hoc when I have the time. And then obviously that'll just be audio stuff, which I can post here or SoundCloud or wherever. But as I say, this is just a month trial till we run around to the next Patreon Q&A session. So please do give feedback in the comments below as to what you think of both this slightly different format for the Drydock and also what you might think, for those of you who have asked questions in the Discord questions thread that haven't been answered yet, what you might think of me answering those questions in that manner. Again, please give feedback, and hopefully we can find a happy medium that doesn't involve me basically doing a 12 to 14 hour recording session to bring near enough 3 hours worth of Drydock all at once. So, yes. Anyway, comment away, ask questions away, and once again, thank you very much for listening.